How can caregivers unwrap strength? That's the topic that we're going to address today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager, and today I have a very special guest. Her name is Jess Ronne, and she is the founder and director of the Lucas Project, which is an organization built to support caregivers. She too is a caregiver. She has a son with multiple diagnoses that will require care for the rest of his life. She's also a multi-published author and a speaker, and she's here to share from her expertise, from her personal experience, for those who are caregivers and for those who care about caregivers, how to unwrap the strength that they need at the holidays and throughout the year. Welcome, Jess. I am so delighted to have you on Flourish-Meant today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In the previous half of our conversation, we talked a little bit about soul care. I do want to dive into some self-care tips for caregivers. That tends to be the very last thing that a caregiver has time for. And we certainly wouldn't have time to do the normal levels of self-care that everyone else that isn't caregiving is able to do. But what are some very essential things that every caregiver needs to make sure they make time to do to take care of themselves?
Well, first of all, I think it begins with dropping the martyr mentality. As a caregiver, I know we're really good at this, and nobody can care for my loved one like I can, and that might be true, but your loved one will survive if you take a couple of hours for yourself while somebody else takes care of them. So I think it's first embracing the fact that you can take some time for yourself and then figuring out what that looks like for you. For me, it's always been walking. I walk every single day. We have, I don't know how many inches of snow on the ground here this morning, and I put on my snow boots and my winter coat and I went out and walked my 2 miles. That's what does it for me. Is just kind of shaking off that stress, getting alone with God. That's where I pray and I listen to my praise and worship music, but that might not be it for somebody else. So figuring out what that is for you and then really prioritizing that and allowing someone else to watch your loved one while you do it. And then I'm a big proponent of like micro pleasures, just little moments of pleasure that you can find in your day-to-day life, especially when you're going through such a challenging period of life. And that may be having a piece of Godiva chocolate and just really savoring it, or taking 5 minutes to do some stretching, or having a glass of wine with your spouse when he comes home, or whatever, those little moments of pleasure that you can eke out in this very challenging season. Just pursue those and try to make them a daily reality for yourself.
Let's talk about compassion fatigue. That's something that a caregiver may not want to admit to anyone that they're experiencing, but it is real. How would you address that?
Oh, I don't know that I even have any great words of wisdom for that, because I even feel that in my advocacy work at times. Most people realize that we created a group home for Lucas this past year, and he moved into that home this past February. So I'm 9 months removed from being a full-time caregiver. And I just kind of hit the wall. I realized I hadn't really taken care of myself in so long. So I guess my only words of advice would be to take care of yourself before it gets to that point of complete burnout. And again, it kind of goes back to that martyr mentality once again, is believing that nobody else can do the job like you can do it, and just allowing other people to step in and help you out.
Flip side of having the compassion fatigue is also guilt. And that is something that
hmm
caregivers struggle with. What if I had done this? Why can't I do more? There's all that guilt and shame that circles around caregiving. How can you unwrap the bonds of guilt and experience peace instead as a caregiver?
Yeah, I mean, I have guilt because I placed my son in a group home. I have guilt over some of the treatment plans that we did or didn't do for Jason. And once again, that guilt is stemming from living in the past. And if we can reframe our perspectives and come back to the present, God is in the present. He's not in the past. And if we want to experience the Lord's grace and mercy and sustenance, we need to stay in the present. So it's recognizing that all of that guilt and that shame is coming from the past. It's coming from the one who does not want good things in our life. And it's rebuking that and stepping into the goodness that the Lord has in store
And
for
that's very
us.
key to recognize that there's an enemy that is called the accuser. That's what Satan means, is accuser,
Hmm.
who's going to step into that space and take the opportunity to shame us and keep us down when God is doing a beautiful thing through us in caregiving, and it doesn't always feel like it. So I'm glad that you brought that out, that there is an element of spiritual warfare there where the enemy is getting you where
Oh,
you're now, right?
absolutely. Yeah. And especially when we're sleep deprived and we're not taking care of ourselves and we're not eating properly.
So, for those who are caregiving and are in a really dark place right now, what advice would you give to them?
I think, first of all, face face the darkness, face it head on, bring it to the Lord, lay it down in surrender, and acknowledge that, Lord, I'm in a dark place. I'm not enjoying this. I want to find joy again in my life. Please show me. Holy Spirit, come in, provide joy in my spirit once again. Then acknowledging that maybe you need some time for yourself. Maybe you need to reevaluate what your caregiving looks like. It might be too much for you. I often think about Moses, who was leading the Israelites and carrying the whole burden by himself. And God was like, no, here are 40 elders to help you carry this burden. And Moses didn't even recognize it in himself that he was so burned out and he needed some help. So finding that help, being honest with your needs, and then prioritizing some time away to do something that does bring you joy and can bring you back to the land of the living. Because as a caregiver, we can become really isolated, really depressed, very stressed, and we need to shake that off somehow. And sometimes it's just getting away from the familiar surroundings that we're embedded in and day out. Maybe it is going for that walk that I referenced earlier and just kind of shaking some of that stress off. Maybe you enjoy thrifting or shopping or getting together for lunch with a friend, but take a few hours away from the daily grind. And I would imagine you will feel much more refreshed in coming back to resume your caregiving duties.
Let's talk a little bit more about the isolation that you mentioned. That is a very key issue for caregivers. How do you battle isolation as a caregiver?
It is just part of the reality of being a caregiver. But again, it's finding those times to try to remove yourself from the environment. And that goes back to the martyr caregiver syndrome, never wanting to leave because what if something happens? And those are real fears. And I felt that too with Lucas when we brought him home from the NICU. Like, what if something happens and he suffocates, and I'm not there? And then with Jason too, what if something happens and I'm not there? And so those are real fears, and you don't have to go far. But I just keep saying the same thing over and over again. But it's finding somebody who can help you, who can step into this really challenging period of time, who can maybe take a couple of things off your plate, like bringing a meal or running some errands for you, so you do have some breathing room. And it's reaching out to people online too. I know support groups have been a lifeline for many caregivers. And we do live in a day and age where technology allows us to connect, almost too much so. At least that's my current opinion. I'm sick of my phone dinging all the time and having messages all the time. But that can be a blessing too when you are so isolated. And I know Facebook was kind of my lifeline when Jason was in hospice, and just being able to connect with people and see their lives and reach out to them. So just finding those connections wherever you're able to.
And the Lucas Project, is that something that you do through that organization as well?
So we do. We have a support group on our page at thelucasproject.org. It's completely free. We also have a resource database. It has over 300 resources for caregivers. And we would love to have you be a part of the support group. We have a lot of really honest, vulnerable conversations. It's very safe. We don't allow any hate speech or anything like that. And we just want to provide an encouraging hopeful, uplifting space for caregivers.
Can you speak to those who love caregivers that want to be more supportive? What are some tips that you might have for them?
Absolutely. I would just say recognize that a caregiver's to-do list is never ending. And I know a lot of people, especially with profoundly disabled individuals like my son, don't feel comfortable providing respite for that type of situation just because they're not familiar with the diagnoses or his needs. Or, I mean, he is nonverbal, he's incontinent, he's 20 years old. So I do understand that. And I completely understand if you are not comfortable stepping into a situation like that, or even in providing respite for an elderly parent or a spouse going through a terminal illness. However, there are millions of ways that you can step into a caregiver's life and help out. I've mentioned meals. We had people detail our cars. I had one woman came into my home and provided haircuts for all of my kids before they went back to school. Another woman bought all of my kids new back to school clothes. Somebody came and mowed our lawn and weeded our flower beds. So I would just say take stock of your talents and offer what you're capable of offering in some way, shape, or form for this caregiving family, and you will bless them immensely, because time is a commodity that we just do not have a lot of when we're in a caregiving role.
For caregivers who are parents of other children who may often feel neglected or left out, and there's nothing you can do about it because you have to put most of your time into the child that has that special diagnosis, how would you advise those parents to deal with the guilt and to still try to do their best to include their other kids in their daily schedules?
Yeah, that was something we struggled with for years, kind of the divide and conquer. Lucas is one of 8 siblings. So, and Lucas doesn't like new experiences or new environments. So, one of us would often stay home with Lucas, and one of us would take the other children out to their activities. We would occasionally try new experiences just because it is good for Lucas to get out and try something. But it was often met with frustration and disappointment because Lucas just did not want to do it. And that would often result in behaviors or aggression. So I think accepting the fact that it is what it is, this is the sibling story, and being really, really intentional about still prioritizing those one-on-one times with those siblings, even though it might be divide and conquer between you and mom or dad. And also, it was such a blessing for me when people would offer to take the siblings to the fun events. So, for example, homecoming or the football games or the basketball games or whatever that looked like, because they recognized that it was challenging for us with a profoundly disabled young man to attend those events, but we didn't want our kids to miss out on the fun events like the camps and the youth group activities at church. So other people would offer to pick up those siblings and then bring them back home again. And if anybody's listening, that's huge for a caregiving family as well.
What are some final tips that you have for caregivers out there to leave with the audience today?
In the book, especially, people keep telling me that I give permission to feel whatever you're feeling. There's such a wide range of emotions when you're going through the caregiving journey, so many ups and downs and highs and lows. My loved one is in remission, yay, and then the cancer comes back and we're back in the lowest of lows. And just permission, allow yourself permission to feel what you're feeling. It's fine. God can handle all of our emotions, all of our feelings, and to try to reframe your perspective. That has been the most helpful thing for me in my caregiving journey, is not to walk around upset all the time. And this is so unfair. And I don't know why I have to do this. And why would God call this of me in my life? But to instead flip the narrative and see it as caregiving is the most holy thing I can do this side of eternity. Caregiving is exactly what Jesus did in his earthly ministry when he came to serve humanity, washing feet, healing lepers, hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors. He was in those smelly, dirty, messy spaces, and he would be right beside us doing this type of work if he were still here. And that has been the biggest game changer for me, so much so that I had a sign made that says, "This is holy work," and hung it above Lucas's bed, so that every time I had to change a brief, or I had to get him dressed, or I had to, bathe him, or whatever that looked like, I was reminded that I was doing holy work. I was doing work that Jesus did while he was here on earth. And I don't know that there is any holier calling we can have this side of eternity than caring for somebody who cannot care for themselves.
Thank you, Jess, for serving the audience today and providing so much grace, so much authenticity, and so many very practical pieces of wisdom and insight. How can people stay connected with you and get even more from the resources you offer, the Lucas Project, and Caregiving with Grit and Grace, your new beautiful devotional book?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm at jessronne.com, thelucasproject.org, caregiverdoc.com. I'm on all the social media channels at either Jess Ronne or Jess plus the mess. And then my book is, I believe, everywhere: Target, Christian Books, Amazon. So go ahead and pick up a copy. It's relevant for anybody in any sort of caregiving role: teachers, physical therapists, even mothers of children, I believe, would get a lot out of this book.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired and encouraged by the grace and grit that we have in our guest, Jess Ronne. And I hope that you will access the wonderful resources that she has mentioned in the podcast today. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.